Just to give you a very quick run through again of who we are, my name is Ragnar Almqvist. I work in the Department of the Taoiseach in our EU division. I'm a diplomat on secondment from our Department of Foreign Affairs. I came back a year ago from posting at the Irish Embassy in Stockholm, and before that I worked in a number of other different positions in the Department of Foreign Affairs, some connected with the EU, some connected with other international organisations. My background as far as education is concerned, I studied English and German. I did a master's in creative writing. I've done a master's in economics. So it's quite wide-ranging, and that's something, a theme we're going to return to, that really independent of what you study, there are opportunities for you to pursue in the EU institutions and in other international organisations. Caoimhe Kett, my colleague from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, is herself a very proud graduate of UCC. Took European Studies here and has gone on to work for the UK Civil Service, for the Scottish Government, and indeed, completing the trio, is now working with the Department of Foreign Affairs here in Ireland. A quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. My initial presentation is going to focus on working within the EU and really look at the questions of where, what it involves, who ultimately works in the EU, what sort of positions there are available there, why you might want to work there, and very briefly a little bit of how you can go about applying for those positions. And I'll frame this in the context of a government campaign that I'm involved in coordinating called EU Jobs Ireland. Well, first question, I guess, relatively obvious: where do EU officials work? Essentially 80% or the vast majority of them are based in Brussels. I don't know if anyone here could give me a guess as to what the largest EU institution is. All right, the European Commission. I don't know if you heard of that. It's the civil service basically of the EU, and it would have directorates which are quite similar to the government departments you get in national administrations. They cover all sorts of areas from environment to trade, economic affairs. The second largest institution then, and again one you would have heard of probably, is the European Parliament, which is based in Brussels and in Strasbourg, bilocated. And I think there are 749 MEPs, all of whom would have, 11 of whom are from Ireland. There are 3 Northern Irish MEPs. All of them would have parliamentary assistants and staff working with them. And then there's the Council of the EU, which is the kind of representational body for member states, and governments of member states would be represented there. There are a great many other institutions and agencies, mostly located in Brussels, but also located in Luxembourg, and several others in terms of the agencies dotted around Europe. We have an agency called Eurofound, which is up in Dublin, and most member states would have an agency or otherwise. But of the 50,000 or so people who work in the EU, the bulk of them are based in Brussels. So that's one thing to consider if you're interested in an EU position. You're going to have to be kind of willing to consider living and working in Brussels. It is a great place, very multilingual, multicultural, so there are lots of reasons to be positive about that. What do EU officials do? Well, I mentioned there are 50,000 or so people working with the EU, including approximately 1,000 from Ireland. They do a great many things. Just to kind of give a little bit of an idea in terms of grouping, in the top right-hand corner there, as you'll see on the screen, are language roles. The EU has 24 official languages. 3 key working languages are English, French and German, but Irish is also an official language of the EU. As are Spanish, Italian, Bulgarian, etc. And to help with the translation of documents, to help with interpreting for European politicians and officials, the EU employs a very significant number of translators and interpreters, as well as specialists called lawyer linguists who are experts in both law and languages. Naturally, the EU is in many respects a legislative-oriented body, so it also recruits large numbers of people with a background and expertise in law, people with a background and interest in politics and history as general administrators. There are those with a particular interest in foreign policy, who would become attached perhaps to the European External Action Service, which is the European foreign ministry, if you like. Increasingly, economics is a really big area of focus for the European Union, and you'd hear about this a lot in the news, the involvement the EU has in monitoring and engaging with governments over their budgets, the involvement of the European Central Bank in different aspects of bank regulation in Ireland and elsewhere across the EU. So there are a lot of economists that they're recruiting actively for, people with a background in audit, business, and so on. So really, the essential point is that almost whatever your background, there's a likelihood that there will be positions in the EU that might be of interest to you. And it's a case of identifying them and applying for them if you're interested in working there. I suppose just to give you an illustration of the impact Irish people have had in the EU, I mentioned the European Commission earlier on as the kind of civil service of the EU and the biggest of the European institutions. It employs about 25,000 people altogether. There have been 5 Secretary Generals of the European Commission over the years, and 2 of them have been Irish. So the last 2, in fact. The lady in the centre of the row of photos there is Catherine Day, who's the current Secretary General of the European Commission. And just beside her, to her right as you're looking, is David O'Sullivan, who was her predecessor. And he's now the EU's ambassador to the United States. That's in itself, I suppose, indicative of just how highly rated, how highly respected Irish officials and Irish people are when they get to work in the EU and just what they can achieve. The other people in the photo here, Emily O'Reilly, who's, I believe she's been given a talk here in UCC on a couple of occasions before. And she's the European Ombudsman. And then either side, I mentioned Mary McGaughey. I mentioned Eurofound earlier on. Mary McGaughey is the Communications Officer with Eurofound based in Dublin. And Kevin Neary, who's a Parliamentary Assistant to Sean Kelly, Irish MEP. So briefly then, who is the EU looking for when it's looking to recruit? These are the kind of key headline criteria, I guess, or requirements when it comes to applying. First thing to say, you must be an EU citizen for 99% of the positions at least that are available in the EU. They employ both graduates and non-graduates. The graduates will obviously be of more interest to you. Fluency in English, French or German, the 3 kind of working languages of the EU is a important qualification, and fluency in English in particular is a really huge asset and something that Irish people bring to the table, which is really highly valued within the EU institutions, and is one of the, I suppose, special selling points that people based here might have. This middle line, if you like, are key competencies which, when it comes to interviewing and looking at your application forms for different positions, the EU will take into account. And this would apply for a great many other international organisations, indeed the Irish Civil and Public Service as well. So that you'd be skilled, resilience I mentioned earlier, and ability to kind of deal with adversity, motivated, good communicative ability, results-driven, analytical, and some potential to lead for some of the more senior positions, I suppose. Something else, and which is relevant to this careers fair in particular, is that you have an ability to speak at least one other EU language in addition to English, French or German. So that could be Irish in the case of Irish people here, and I'm sure there's some Irish students and graduates in the audience, or it could be any one of the other 23 European languages. And then obviously, as I mentioned, you're going to have to be prepared to and want to really live and move to Brussels or Luxembourg, and to be interested in working in a multicultural, multilingual environment. I suppose a fundamental question, why would you choose to consider an EU career? First of all, I think the work is extremely interesting and worthwhile. For the EU, you're working on behalf of more than 500 million European citizens. So when it comes to developing public policy, you're probably at the elite level. It's a fantastic working environment to be based in Brussels, to be working with colleagues from 27 other different member states. There's tremendous range and flexibility in terms of the training and learning opportunities, not just as far as language, but also in terms of skill development. Something which is great about the role is that you seldom stay in the same position for longer than a few years. So there's constant movement and change, I suppose, in what you can be doing. And from a policy point of view, that's a really positive thing. And ultimately, I suppose, it's a chance to make a real difference in the lives of people. And I think that's probably the thing that motivates anyone to get into public service, whether it be at the national level, working in an NGO or international organisation, and particularly I think also in the EU institutions. So I'll quickly run through the how. First of all, I think that Probably the best first step to take in considering a career with the EU is to look at the opportunities they have for professional traineeships. Essentially paid traineeships that give you a chance to spend 5 months working in one of the EU institutions, the Commission, Parliament or whatever, and really give you an opportunity to develop some sort of experience and understanding of the work of the EU. The value of undertaking a traineeship in the EU institutions is that you're given really important work right from day one. There's another colleague of ours, Grace, who started recently with Cueva in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and she had worked as a spokesperson for one of the European commissioners. And as an English speaker, as someone who's a good communicator, I think she was saying within about 2 weeks of starting as a trainee in that office, she was writing speeches for the commissioner. If you have the ability and are engaged, coming on as a trainee within the EU institutions is something that will give you an immediate chance to demonstrate that ability and to show your capacities. It's great from a career development perspective. Obviously, if you go on to apply for permanent positions in the EU, it's a huge asset. But even if you go on to do something entirely different, whether it's working in public administration like Cueva or myself, or going into private enterprise, chances are most companies, most organisations are going to have a lot to do with Brussels day to day. So by having shown and demonstrated your engagement and your connections with the EU, it'll really further and develop your CV. So that's something to be conscious of as well. So the traineeships are available basically in all the EU's institutions and agencies. There's a different application process for each one, but at our EU Jobs campaign, what we try and do is provide some sort of advice and a steer for people when it comes to applying. And as I said, if you sign up to the newsletter and otherwise, you'll get notifications month by month of the traineeship positions as they become available, and also some advice about how to complete the application form. The other thing to keep in mind if you are considering applying for a trainee position is take a look at a kind of organisation we work closely with called European Movement Ireland. They have what's called the Green Book, which is kind of a Bible, if you like, for the European Stagiaire or traineeship programme, and you'll find details of it at europeanmovementireland.ie. I won't talk to you too much about the permanent positions just now, just run through. There are very, very many. They run in competition cycles, so the next major one of interest to graduates here will probably open in March of 2015. They're open to people who are in their final year of studies or postgraduates. But for the most part, I think people who are successful in the competitions tend to have some prior experience of having worked in the EU. That may be as a stagiaire, it may be in a kind of temporary contract position, or as Cueva with another organisation or government or whatever. But it tends to be a big asset in applying for these posts. So just to run through, as I said, the next big competition for graduates in the kind of main policy development area is going to be in the spring of this year. But there are also positions for linguists and translators. They open in the summer. Very briefly, there are other avenues as well to positions within the EU institutions. Contract agent posts are one, temporary agents another. These are basically somewhat more specialist roles in the case of temporary agents. And the competition process is somewhat simpler. The paying conditions aren't quite as good, and you tend to be on for a specified contract period. And finally, just as a single take-home point from my perspective anyway, do send us an email at eujobs@taoiseach.ie if you have any questions or any areas you're especially interested in. If you do apply for positions in the EU, and if you're called to an interview stage for any competition, make sure and get in touch with us, because we offer one-to-one training and advice free of charge at that point from some experts in the EU competition process, and that's a real help because these competitions can be quite challenging, I suppose. So I'll finish there.